like the weirdest times. We live in the weirdest times. And the APP and the body piercing archive, no different. That's where we'll be ending up, by the way. But this is where we're beginning. And one of the things is, if you're fans of the archive and you happen to see the fucking gorgeous commercial that we did for it way back in 2019, like John Balk knocked it out of the ballpark. It had like Ethel Granger, and it had Mr. Sebastian, and it had Tattoo Sammy, and it had Mr. Sebastian. Like, it's beautiful. If you haven't seen it, go YouTube it. It's fantastic. Well, like many of us, I got a little crazy during COVID, and I just kept working because that's what kept me from being crazy. And pretty soon it's like, oh my God, this is like enough to open up an entire museum. This will not actually work. It was like, I don't remember, 40 banners or something. It was insane. It was like, oh, this got out of control on me. Like, this is just not doable. So I'm like, we got to break it up into like maybe 3 exhibits. Turns out we're going to do 2 exhibits. So one's going to be the Mr. Sebastian exhibit and the rise of the UK, and then the other one we'll talk about at the very end, which is going to be the Grangers, which it's kind of like kids. You're not supposed to have favorites. I don't know. I'm just madly and nutsy and crazy about all this. So we'll start with the bad news. For those, I think you know that Jeremy Castle, who is the keeper of the Alan Oversby archive, which is the Mr. Sebastian archive, he was not able to join us. He's got surgery he has to get. He'll be fine, but he wasn't able to join us. My sadness around that, I'm going to try, I have audio interviews. I'm going to try at some point to get a video interview. It's like, he was lovers and friends, and like, he's got outrageous stories.
And he saved all this, and he's got loads more of this. I've got, find me during the convention, I've got loads of it digitized as well. And he had so much stuff that he basically thought someone's going to come looking for this one day.
Yeah. I mean, like we could just like, by the way, if you get the book, like butthole piercings, they're real. We always thought it was like, oh, that's just one of those urban myths. You can't pierce. Like, I'm like laughing at Jeremy, like who's like you know, like butthole piercings, really? And it's like, oh yeah. He's like, I've done 60 of them. Jeremy's also a piercer. He's like, I've done like 60 of them. I'm like,
wow.
Come on! All right, what kind of problems? He's like, no problems.
There's a lot of buttholes in that archive.
Yeah, no problems. I'm like, and he's a registered nurse. And I'm like, no, like nuts. Anyways.
Tattooed black buttholes.
Yes, all that stuff.
With comments on the back saying it's such a shame he's tattooed this beautiful butthole.
All that is in the book.
Oh my God.
So now it's this part is like great serendipity because Jeremy dropped out. Matt's really stepping up. Matt's going to introduce himself in just a minute. And at first we were going to do like, I'll do one, and then Matt'll do one, and then Jeremy will do one. And Matt's like, let's just do them all together. So like, you guys, like this night is the only night that Matt and I are doing all the tours together. So you're going to see like what nerdy fangirls we are, and we bounce off of each other. So anyways, we hope you like it. It is, although, be gentle with us. You may want to do one later in the week, because you're our guinea pigs. Anyways, take it away.
Yeah, hi. My name's Dr. Matt Lodder. I am an art historian. I teach at the University of Essex. I have been, I'm a tattoo and piercing guy first, and an academic second. I'm not one of these. Well, I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, I'm bored with my like Renaissance manuscripts. Because there are quite a lot of those. But yeah, I basically kind of got into piercing and onto piercing internet, like RAB and BME in like 1994, 1995 when I was 15 years old, and it was like just before Mr. Sebastian passed away, and so like his kind of life and his story is a real kind of pivotal moment in me learning about piercing. He's a big feature in Modern Primitives, if you've read that book, which is a kind of interesting book that I've written an article about, which Paul doesn't agree with.
That's how, isn't it nice though? You can still be friends. You don't have to agree with everything. And it's not that I don't agree with everything, I agree with much of it. Anyway, go on.
That's for the bar later on. But I'm primarily a historian of Western tattooing from the like early modern periods to the present day. I've got a book coming out in a couple of months called Painted People, History of Tattooing, History of the World in 21 Tattoos, which is kind of a history through tattooing rather than a history of tattooing. But there's a chapter about Mr. Sebastian, because he sits at this really interesting intersection of tattooing, piercing, law, popular culture, music. He's just a really interesting guy. One of the first tattooers in the UK to have an art degree. Just a really interesting guy about which we can talk a lot. So I'm also doing an hour-long talk about, which goes into a lot more detail than I'll go into here, about some of the legal case that he was involved with, which we'll talk about at the end. And yeah, I was really, through my friend Alex Binney, who you'll encounter later on, who was tattooed by Sebastian in the early 90s, late 80s. Basically, he said, oh, you should go and chat to this guy, Jeremy. So I went and met Jeremy, and Jeremy showed me all the stuff, and I was like, fuck, this is amazing. A really kind of unstudied, untold piece of tattoo history, as well as piercing history. And then I was doing some talks. Paul came to one and was like, I need to do an exhibition of this stuff.
Well, I mean, I didn't even know that I wanted to do an exhibition until I talked to Jeremy, and 10 hours of interviews later, I'm like, we got to do more. Tattooing and piercing intersect in ways that are deeper than I think most people realize. Tattooing and piercing are much gayer than most people realize. Like the real pivotal points of tattoo history come through gay history and queer history, and then through piercing. So all of these dots join up, and I think like Sebastian, his network, the people he was talking to in the late 70s, is a really interesting funnel point for what came afterwards and the world that was created in the following decades. So I think it's a really nice place to kind of, talk about a lot of stuff that's not just about him. Yeah. So here's, again, schematically, if you can take a step back, remember, like, this was, no, not literally, so sorry, figuratively, American talking in figuratives. So remember, like, this was originally, like, how do I tell the whole entire European history? No, that's not going to work. How do I tell the whole entire UK history? Wow, that's not even going to work.
And in doing this, we've uncovered new archives.
Yeah, so much has been done. So really, you're getting a glimpse before the 50s, and that glimpse before the 50s is then going to tie into deeper histories that will be told in the Grangers, and then really we're taking you from the 50s forward.
Yeah.
What we're beginning to do, this is such, for the nerds, the historical nerds, what we're really doing is taking these random pictures, these random names, these random histories, and we're finally beginning to connect the dots and show that they're not random. There is connection, there was community. It just looked very different.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one. So this wasn't originally supposed to be here, but it makes perfect sense to be here. So for those that have taken lectures from me before, I fell into doing this lecture series on piercing porn, because I'd always kind of like, oh yeah, there's piercing history in porn, but it's super problematic, and then I realized, no, there's so much fantastic history in it. So one of the discoveries that I had was this guy named P. Booth. And P. Booth, when you start to read this, and I will invite you all to come back, but I'm really going to encourage you to come back with your piercer eyes on, with your, like, this is someone that is not just one-handed writing. This is someone that actually understands. Now, you may not agree with his interpretation of piercing and technologies, and some of his history isn't accurate, but this is someone that deeply cares about history and deeply cares about piercing, and we have no idea who he is. He was a traveling piercer. He was doing all this. Can't even tell you beyond the P. Booth.
Early 70s.
We know he was English. We know, like, he didn't pierce her. This is like a German, like that, again, part of the whole mail order catalog, like the Tattoo Sammy and stuff like that, circa. But like these photos are circulating I believe the first publication, and then it was 2 years before he writes again for this publication, and then nothing after, was about 1973. This is before Mr. Sebastian. And again, he just had his little bag and he'd go around and he'd like pierce. And he was doing single ears, he was doing multiples, he was doing nostril, and he was doing nipple piercings.
And we spend a lot of our time looking at old fetish magazines and fetish correspondence, right? So in the eras before Victorian magazines, people were basically kind of, before the internet, before Twitter, they were like corresponding in the correspondence pages of random magazines. So, and it's really interesting, and one of the things that Paul and I are trying to do is like untangle the kind of fiction, where people are clearly writing fiction, with reality and how those things intersect, right? Because a lot of the writing is clearly by people who are imagining what piercing is like.
100%.
Right? That goes right back into the 19th century. These are in magazines like Family Doctor, English Mechanic, London Life, like these kind of magazines. Bizarre, yeah. So people are imagining, but then it's clear that sometimes people then take inspiration from those imaginings and then take them into reality. Good example of that, in Japan, right, we found some like really early, like 1950s septum piercing in Japanese fetish magazines from the 50s. I found those. Where they're clearly initially imagined and they're drawn, and then a couple of years later, people are like, oh, we'll try that, it looks fun, and then it's photography, like in the early 50s.
And that's sorry to jump in, but that's the importance. Like, just because something like you can look at it and go, oh, that's clearly not real, but someone's reading it and it's planting the seed of what is possible. And I promise you, just like, again, if you've attended any of my presentations, you've heard like, you know, people will look at National Geographic and that 1% or that 0.1% would do it. And it's the same thing. So even if you're reading fantasy, just the fact that it's in the ether, it's out there, people are going to be doing it.
Yeah, cool.
Oh my God. So if you end up nerding out the way I have nerded out on Cyril Wilkinson, you are going to find out more about Cyril in 2024 when we do the Granger's lecture. He is so important. He is the first celebrity piercer. Definitively. From 1948, the newspapers were referring to him and interviewing him when they had any questions or whatever about piercing, they would go to Cyril Wilkinson. Cyril Wilkinson literally was the piercer of the royals. He was the one piercing all of the royals, like, you know, Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, like, and on and on and on and on. And of course, that's what helped get him his fame. Literally every single thing we could find about him, because there wasn't that much, like, we make reference to in this chart. So make sure you come back and get a chance to read over this chart. So just things that, like, I mean, okay, it's not piercing related, but like, it's kind of cool. There was this thing called the Ghost Club in London, and it was a gentleman's club. I think they eventually allowed women to join. And at one time it was the oldest club dedicated to exploring the metaphysical. And the thing is, like, they would have their like cigars and their fires raging and burning, and they would show films, and they would have guest lecturers come and talk about ghosts or spirit mediumship or whatever. Before or sometime early when he was a piercer, he was also a conjurer. And one of my favorite things that I discovered reading old articles is like a lot of his clients would never even see the piercing implement, because he'd be talking to them and using sleight of hand, and the next thing you know, you're piercing your stuff and you're healed and see ya. So yeah, he was very quick with his hands and very soothing with folks, and they really just loved being pierced by him. One of the things that was fabulous for me to discover, and we discover it in correspondence between Fakir Mushafar and William Granger, between William Granger and Fakir Mushafar, I'm like drawing a blank, is that William Granger and Cyril Wilkinson knew each other. And again, you're going to find information on that. So like, this is in the 60s. Fakir and William are writing back and forth, and William Granger who I feel like I kind of know now. He was a I don't want to say
Science nerd.
super nerdy. And again, this isn't a lecture on him. And a little, I don't know. Maybe he was a little spectrum. It's hard. Like I'm not going to clinically diagnose him, but like he was super detail oriented, like almost obsessively compulsive. And when I first started reading his stuff, I'm like, okay, so this man's either lived an incredible life or he's got a problem with truth.
Or both.
Right. But so what I started doing when I was reading his biography is I wrote down everything, because he wrote down every interview, every appearance they did, all of it. I took it, and this was probably about 10 years ago, and I went to the British Library, and this is how I fell down the London life hole.
Yeah.
I started looking up, and like every time he said he wrote a letter, every time he was on a TV, all of it was true. Oh yeah, and I discovered a comet. So like when you're like reading this, you're like, dude, you're so full of shit. It's like, no, he discovered a comet. In fact, I think he was the first to take a photograph of 2 different comets. Anyways, in an observatory that he built in his backyard. Like if you're reading this, it's like, you're fucking full of shit, and it's all true. So when he tells me why this matters to this presentation, so when he tells me that, like, yeah, when I met Cyril Wilkinson, he was super enthralled with Ethel, of course, because she had the tiniest waist in the world, and he had never done nipple piercings to this point. But like since 1948, he'd been doing men's ears. And again, if you've heard any of my lectures, you understand like an earlobe piercing was not an earlobe piercing then. Like an earlobe piercing is what we think of like a nipple piercing now. It was something provocative, something edgy. Even with women, it was a little edgy. If it was a man, it would be more racy than an earlobe, than a nipple piercing, because you couldn't hide it. So like the fact that like in 1948 he's doing men's, like it's really provocative. And after he meets the Grangers, when he's doing all the millions of press articles that he's done, not millions, but dozens of articles, he would start talking about, well, you know, there's this woman who's got a fabulously small waist and tons of, and he would start to mention Ethel Granger, and he would start to mention, well, I've heard that some people will do nipple piercings. So again, he's putting it out there. He's like, he's not risking his brand, but he's letting people know that it is possible. So this beautiful young woman that we're going to see in just a moment, Annette Gay, turns out, and I find this out in a letter of William writing to, I think it's in William's biography. It's in William's biography. He talks about that Annette Gay was actually Cyril Wilkinson's daughter. So this model that he's using over and over and over again and not telling anyone, it's just this gorgeous customer, it's actually his daughter.
No way.
And one of the things that's really interesting, someone mentioned Bazaar magazine back there, is there's a picture in Bazaar magazine that was actually from London Life that John Willie, thank you, used. And we could do a whole lecture on John Willie. Like,
Yes, please.
most of his aesthetic is borrowed. It's not, I mean, he's a fantastic artist, but most of his aesthetic was borrowed from London Life. Anyways, we'll get to that. So when you look at like, there's like this wonderful like, these pictures where he's showing like her nose getting prepared for the piercing, and he's like approaching it from the side. It's all for a nostril piercing, and then she ends up with the septum ring. Well, it's all fake. But again, so like, you know, on one hand it's like, oh, God damn it, it's fake. But no, it's that planting of the seed. It's putting it out in the ether. It's giving all these people ideas of what they could get done. Yes, she had one nostril piercing, but she didn't have a double nostril piercing that he just pierced with the rings. That's because it looked good for the photograph. This man knew how to sell. And, you know, he legitimately was the first celebrity piercer. So we're all going to come in here. This is our Cyril Wilkinson room, and all the photos are like original press photos showing like over here the royal family sporting the earrings that they were able to wear because of Cyril Wilkinson. Over here, press photos of Annette Gay. She was a dancer. This is a program from the dance hall that she danced at, and I just by accident, there's an ear piercing specialist ad on the
By
first.
accident.
On,
I
so
never
nuts.
this one.
Yeah, so nuts. So incredible program, and she was living in a trailer with her husband behind this theater when the Grangers went over to meet her. So they actually went over and met her, but that's kind of an aside, but it's really cool. All right, so let's hope this works. Want everyone to be able to hear. Hopefully it doesn't blast you.
In a Mayfair studio, the man who pierced the ears of royalty gets ready to try out a new beauty spot. His idea is to wear diamonds the way you pay for them, through the nose. A dab of freeze, a flame to sterilize the needle, and Cyril Wilkinson is ready to operate. It's over in a second, and the patient doesn't feel a thing. In goes the diamond pin, and who said girls never turn up their noses at diamonds? It's one way, thanks to Cyril, to make a girl's face her fortune, literally.
So obviously she already had a healed nostril piercing, but I do want to give a shout out to like freehand piercing. That is not me. And the apparatus that he used was made of gold. My guess is it was probably custom because I haven't come across anything in the patent section. Any other examples of it? I think he probably had it made for him. But what I would love is for Matt to talk a little bit about the importance of British Pathé.
Yeah.
And like,
well, so this guy, the voiceover on this, it leads into something I was going to say. So the voiceover there for British Pathé, which is a newsreel service, so these were shown before cinema broadcasts, basically. So you go to the cinema and this would be kind of in where we'd have ads now. This part of London in Mayfair, round the corner, was George Burchett's private studio where he was doing permanent tattoo makeup and tattooing wealthy clientele and doing kind of eyebrows and cheeks and rouging, like literally on the same kind of road, like round the corner in Grosvenor Square. And there's a great video from a little bit earlier than this, I think, from the late 30s with the same voiceover of a guy talking about Burchett tattooing a dragon on a girl's leg that also he's drawing on with pen and not actually tattooing. But like, I think what's worth saying, just from a kind of historiographical point of view here, is that like, when we see this stuff, the fact that there's piercing or tattooing on middle class people, on women, whatever it might be, just because it's happening doesn't mean it wasn't odd. Like the fact that it makes these newsreels is sort of indicative that it's kind of still, it's not shocking in the same way as it might have become later on, but it's curious, right? So there's this interesting crossover between like, it's kind of out in the open and it's happening, and it's kind of, you can go in as a paying customer and pay someone to pierce your nostril or get tattooed. But at the same time, it's kind of a bit eccentric.
Right. It's newsworthy. It's
Yeah.
interesting. It's captivating. People are going to want to see this. And also with British Pathé, I mean, this is huge. It's not like the previews you see before movies now. Like for many people, this was like their primary way of getting news. Certainly visual.
You haven't got TVs in your house at this point.
And
right?
people would play this stuff everywhere. William Granger saw this, ordered a copy because he was a nerd that would show films, had it in his own personal collection, would also do viewings of this little 49 second pre-movie commercial thing.
Yeah.
Like, it was crazy.
And the British Pathé were kind of interested a lot, and a lot of the early film we have of British tattooing, and in particular, is from British Pathé reels, right? So there's a couple of George Burchett back into the 1920s. But I think a lot of people do sort of take when I talk about these older histories that are older than people realise. A lot of the time, I think people take that as like, oh well, it was just sort of everywhere and everyone was doing it. Like the fact it was present doesn't mean it was like normal, but the fact it was presented in this way sort of shows you that it wasn't kind of like, what are these disgusting people doing to themselves? There was a bit of that. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say as you were talking about piercing. There have been, we'll talk about some of it in a minute, but some of the earlier histories of piercing would have been on sideshow performers, like people like the great Omi, who was tattooed by Burchett, had a big septum ring in the 1930s. But it's very much linked in with basically kind of racism, right? Like tattooing and piercing towards the Second World War and in the immediate aftermath becomes kind of linked with an idea of primitiveness, right? An idea of atavism, idea of backwardness. And so I think like it's also worth kind of viewing these this particular moment, the 30s, 40s, and 50s in particular, through that lens of like there's a little bit of the prurient, a little bit of the edge is like, oh, white people are doing this.
Yeah,
you know,
100%.
And people like Omi were doing it deliberately, playing with that, but that's where a lot of this kind of like, oh,
we don't do this.
Yes. Yeah.
And yet we are doing it. Yeah. Supercharged. So what I handed down here, and again, this will be like where I really want to invite you guys to come back, is a book of articles, like all these articles that I was talking about Cyril. Like dig in, like come back.
And you can email Paul and I, and we'll share stuff with you all day long as well, because we're
I'm really busy. If it's important, I promise I will. But like, well, Matt's much better about that. I'm like, oh my god, I'm so busy. But I will share all of it with you here.
So,
Was there not a level of legality regarding piercing about that?
No. No, there wasn't when I started piercing. We used to, at the Gauntlet, we used to like, I'm not kidding, like annually call up the health department and see if they would come inspect us. Because we wanted that, we knew our shit was tight, and we wanted to be able to say like, approved by the health department. We're like, yeah, we don't cover it.
And in fact, and again, I'll talk more about this tomorrow, or on Tuesday when I'm doing my talk about the law, but there was no, so the law governing this stuff in Britain came in 1861. The Offences Against the Person Act, and basically like ear piercing in particular is basically excused because it's like, well, women have been pierced ears for ages.
Natural.
So, and there's no law against tattooing people under 18 until 1969. One person does get charged before that, but under a kind of assault statute rather than a tattooing illegally statute. There's no real regulation about this stuff at all until the 90s actually, in terms of piercing.
And of course, and then if we talk the states, it's just totally different. It's like state by state, county by county. They all have their own histories. This is kind of like the chaos room. Like I don't know how I feel about it because there's just so much here, but it's all tied together, and we only have so many square foot, and so we wanted to make sure that this was tied together. I'm gonna like kind of give the overview, but I'm hoping you'll dive in.
Yeah, this is more in my wheelhouse.
So, Bill Scoose, like if you don't know about the Scoose family, he's going to tell you about it. It's kind of funny if this was a tattoo convention, they'd be like, why the fuck are you talking about Bill Scoose? He's like the least famous of the Scooses. But he had a mail order catalog, and that mail order catalog is where many of the images that we'll see reproduced over and over and over again came out of this mail order catalog. And unlike Coble, again, if you've been to any of my presentations, Coble's like, he's dealing with American censors and American US mail laws. His stuff isn't nearly as racy. Like this guy was sending out, full nudes of Mr. Sebastian and all these other people with pierced cocks and labia.
And his wife.
Huh?
And his wife.
And his wife, Rusty, who I'm going to let you talk about in just a second. Rusty Scoose. How should we do it? Should we let you then now take over on Scoose?
Yeah, I can tell you about stuff. Right, so as Paul was saying, like weirdly, so we've got Mr. P. Booth in the early 70s, and we've got Mr. Sebastian in the kind of mid to late 70s. Mr. Sebastian describes, as we'll talk about this in more detail, basically kind of having to figure this stuff out because no one knew. So he talks really about kind of learning how to pierce, basically kind of by figuring out as he went along.
And talking to the Americans.
And talking to the Americans.
Which blew my mind. I'm like, wait, there's people like P. Booth there. What, you guys aren't talking to each other? There's all these artists getting pierced in like the 50s.
But, right, so loads of British tattooers in the 50s had nipple rings. Yeah. And so this guy, Rich Mingus, was a London tattooer, quite shy, quite introverted, didn't give a lot of interviews to the press. But he was a really amazing artist and he was a collector. There's a book that the Amsterdam Tattoo Museum put out, which is a reproduction. It was about 10 years ago.
It's so good.
It's amazing. It's a reproduction of his scrapbook, and it's full of photos from the 1950s back to the kind of 90s.
Thank you. The economic.
I was going to say 50 years ago.
No, me and Paul stopped thinking about history in 2005.
It's like,
It's true.
what is this? Like, what is this last 20 years?
Yeah.
So, like, our job and what I ask of you is to really try and put the context.
Yeah.
So, there are not the hormones that are available now. There are not the surgeries nearly as widespread. Like, you really had to be set financially to be doing some of the sex changes that you saw in the 30s and the 40s and like, it was such an outlier. But you know what you could do? And this is what I would argue. Like, I don't have definitive proof, but like the level of commitment, if you are tattooing a feminine item of clothing, either it's a very strong fetish or it's a very strong identification of your identity, or both, which absolutely
There's lots of photos of tucking as well. Like, looks like, in fact, there's one there.
right there.
Exactly.
So my argument would be that what we're looking at is early representation of trans identity, where it's playing with what Fakir would call gender fluid or gender flex. Like, it's playing with gender for sure. So,
but just to really reiterate, that whole history disappeared when, even out of the oral history, even out of the communal knowledge of people that were old enough to know at the time, like George Bone. Like, by the time Sebastian's trying to start again in the 70s, like, no one knows anything.
like, that is one of the things that was so mind-blowing about Mr. Sebastian's history, is you'll hear it, you'll read it, like, sorry, maybe that's the next one. You can hear it, you can read it, like, he's like, well, no one knew anything here, so I went to America. And I'm like,
Or I figured it out.
P. Booth. Yeah, like, or I figured out, like, P. Booth. I mean, like, people were doing piercing.
And people that Sebastian was like 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from.
But there wasn't a sharing culture of that technology. So, Tattoo Club of America, this is the UK history. Why are we talking about Tattoo Club of America? Because of Rudy Inhelder. He was Swiss-born, intellectual, of a certain education, and
As a lot of these people are, actually, as it happens.
And he just happened to read this book called, Pierced Hearts and True Love in '54, and he's really young, and he writes to the journalist, and he's like, I love this book, tell me more.
It's a tattoo history book. It's the last, like, unbelievable thing that came out 70 years ago. It's the last proper narrative history of Western tattooing. It came out 70 years ago. I'm writing another one.
Are you saying that? Are you declaring
Well,
that?
I am declaring that.
All right.
Literally my job.
We have you on
I
film.
don't know much, but it's literally my job today.
I believe you.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Like, are you being, all right, yeah, literal. So, like, it just happened to be 1954. He just happened to write into a journalist. The journalist just happened to give him Rich Mingan's names, and he just happens to have the desire, the ways, and the means to get over to London to meet Rich Mingan right as they're forming the London Tattoo Association, and he's there at this party with his mind and his background, documenting it, meeting people, taking photographs, starts collecting. He's got the fever. He's just an enthusiast, but he loves it. So Rudy Inhelder then, in '63, moves to New York and is talking to some friends and is like, I'm a tattoo nerd. I love tattooing. Wait, there's nothing really here? There's not, like...
Les was writing to one guy in the US, a guy called Al Shafley from Sandusky, Ohio. And Al Shafley was coming over to the UK, but there wasn't a huge network. And actually, like, really was really influenced by the British Tattoo Club, by the London clubs, just to start, like, it wasn't just for tattooers, it was for everyone who was interested in tattooing, right? So it was correspondence, sharing pictures, and a kind of pen pal thing. If you were a professional, be sharing, like, where'd you get your inks from? Where'd you get your designs from? Like, how do I do this stuff? And Paul points out, like, if you come back and have a proper look at these, like, this is the like, kind of sign-up sheet that Rudy was circulating. And he's like, what are you interested in? Are you interested in meeting other people? Are you interested in the history of tattooing. Do you want pictures? Do you want pictures of tattooed women? Oh, maybe if you say no, maybe that means you're someone I want to talk to because Rudy was gay. So he's getting everyone's names, addresses, phone numbers, and then he's getting a list of all your tattoos, and then right at the bottom there, a list of your piercings. 1965, right? So there's enough crossover here that he's interested in like trying to, you know, connect. And if you look at the list of members, it's like so many of the most important tattooers in the world at the time. Jeff Baker in the UK, Ron Ackers, Sailor Jerry's on this list, Rich Mingus is on this list, but also, oh, you're back. Yeah, there's so many names on this list. Like,
are you tripping now that we're actually reading it?
Yeah, but basically, like, this is a list of people who are interested in tattooing, and pretty much everyone on this list kept an archive of people who were interested in tattoo history, who've stopped stuff being thrown away into the bin, and like so many of the stuff we know about tattoo history is because people like this were keeping it, and they would talk to each other because of Les, because of Rudy.
Did you talk about the questionnaire?
I did, yeah.
Awesome. And the little like at the bottom.
I did, amazing.
Awesome. So
yeah.
And then from that name on the list, Bud Husson, was a pseudonym for Bud Huizinga, which is Viking Navarro. So what would happen is, like you said, people would write in to Rudy and Helder. He'd see who he thought was a good fit for you, and he would connect people. He'd play matchmaker. And then they would start writing letters like, Dear Bud, 1965, many thanks for your letter dated the 15th of August. I'm pleased to learn that you are interested in piercing and tattooing. My piercings, as yet, are not as extensive, and they've all been done by myself. I first pierced my nipples and have gradually enlarged the holes in them by means of gold rings. The holes are now a 1/4 inch in diameter, the holes. So 1/4 inch, for those that aren't quick at, that's 6 millimeters or 2 gauge. It's a well-stretched hole.
1965.
He goes on, I'm interested in splitting my penis. I'm turned on by tattoos and piercing. I often stand in front of the mirror and masturbate. So like, what they would do is they'd like suss out like, how safe is this to talk about? How safe is it to like exchange what type of photos? And they would start building on that shared trust. They'd start building.
Then he's running through this guy Stanley Porter, who's got some of those little, you know, stockingy tattoos. Who's also been tattooed by George and Leslie Burchett, those people that I was talking about earlier on, which is also the first place that Mr. Sebastian got tattooed. So this is like mainstream centre of the tattoo world at the time.
So they're coming together. They're starting to connect. But of course, being Viking, Navarro is really famous with them. He's one of the original modern primitives. Also friends with Fakir Mushafar. Did you point out Roland Loomis on here?
I didn't, but you can do that now.
Roland Loomis is Fakir Mushafar.
Yeah.
1963. He's on the mailing list. This is where these people start making
There's
these
not enough
connections.
tattoo nerds for it to have properly splintered between like the queer separate underground and the big mainstream. Like that list of people is it's such an eclectic list of people, and especially know what would happen later on. Like Jeff Baker was the president of like the British Tattoo Association for a long time, big publisher. But it's this weird list, and Cindy Ray's on there as well from Australia.
Who was super into piercing faces.
Because the industry wasn't big enough for it to be diverse and splintered, right?
But even some of these enthusiasts that are like, well, who's Tom Fothergill? Well, it's Tillip Cardiff. It's this guy over here. And so you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So in the 60s, he's starting to write to Fakir already, when Fakir is still just rolling. And look, if you were here for the exhibit in 2019, that device, he's showing him how he drew, he's showing him how he did it, and he's sharing it with Fakir. I don't know for a fact, but I would argue that Fakir probably got that design from Till. And they're sharing these technologies back and forth. This is him writing into Mr. Sebastian. He doesn't meet Mr. Sebastian until 1980, super late. 1980 is when he meets sailors. He had met Fakir almost 20 years before.
Why couldn't they get together?
Because it was just fractured. It wasn't the internet. So it was like, they met by writing in on an article, like an ad at the back of the tattoo catalog.
Yeah.
That's how, and they just happened to meet. Sailor Sid quickly, like once he sees this stuff, he like quickly goes over.
And this is the thing, right? So loads of these people know each other close, they're friendly, but some of them don't know each other personally, they're just corresponding, or they're one or two. It's a network of people that sort of know each other, or know of each other, not necessarily like they're all getting together and hanging out all the time.
Yeah. So Sid goes back to meet Tom, interviews him for the PFIQ, which is where we had this really famous article of him inverting his penis with all of his modifications. But he had been piercing himself since 1925. You could very easily go in that Granger's, because he is like deep history. 1925, 14, he's piercing his nipples. Yeah, wild history. These are some really old pictures here.
Yeah,
Because he's probably in his 20s here.
Yeah.
By the time we're over here, he's 70. When he's doing this PFIQ, he's 70. He's had this whole life. And it's really lovely. Like, you start to know, he would write like 25-page letters. He was definitely lonely, even though he was married. He would go through, I would really encourage you to read this, he would have periods where, of depression, but his depressions would last sometimes a couple of years. And one of the things that would bring him out of it was thrill-seeking, his projects. And his wife was clearly not into it, but she would let him have his projects. And what was his projects? It's fucking getting wild over here. It's all this experiment. He was also a man who had sex with men, but like, that's where, like, again, understanding at the time, this is what, as you said, and it's true, this is what trans could look like. This is what gay could look like. It was like, how do you navigate a world where, like, it was illegal. You could go to jail for being a homosexual at this time.
Yeah, before the 50s.
Oh,
There was,
no, I think
in the UK,
when did the wolf?
yeah, it's
global-
1954
Oh, that
or
late?
something, yeah.
Okay.
There's also a guy with a big septum ring at Les Scoos, was the first tattoo artist in Britain to have an art show, a big art gallery, Camden Art Centre, 1972, and one of the guys there has got a massive septum ring. These streams are crossing, but still our intrepid hero, Mr. Sebastian, has to.
1967, I think. No, legalized homosexual acts in England and Wales on the condition that they were consensual in private between adults. 1967. And the reason why I bring that up is because when they were living together in the early 60s, it was still totally illegal.
Yeah.
They were living under the time when it was illegal. Sorry, I'm like, wait a second, you screwed up my timelines.
But Sebastian, so he gets tattooed by George Burchett, or by Leslie Burchett. He first appears in the British press in the early 70s as a customer of George Bones, who'd been a customer of Mingins. As a school teacher, this mild-mannered school teacher called Alan, because literally it's like he's being presented as this, tattooing is really acceptable now because school teachers are doing it. Fucking this guy.
Little did they know.
Little did they know, but he's quoted as saying, my mother would be so cross if she knew I was getting tattooed. I have to keep them secret from her. He was an art teacher from Liverpool. He was probably the first, or certainly one of the first British tattoo artists to have an art degree. So he'd been to art school. He just fancied the hell out of tattooed men and wanted to be tattooed himself. And again, sort of found himself by getting tattooed by Leslie Burchett at the centre of this, nexus of very pivotal moment in time.
I believe, other than, so he got the tattoo, the star on his hand at about, I'm just guessing right now, sorry, about 1955. He was like about 20 years old. And that was his first tattoo, and he doesn't get another tattoo for a while, but he goes to Guyana, where we get the very famous PFIQ article. He's in Guyana. He sees on a couple of field hands that they've got their nipples pierced. He's like, I don't know why, that's just the hottest thing ever. I want to get it done. And he goes and he visits this guy, this Portuguese guy who's the piercer.
He's on like a kind of like year out, gap year kind of thing. Working on a sugar plantation.
This was just under the needle.
Yeah.
And a slightly larger pair of sleepers, no thicker gauge, but larger diameter. I did one all right. The second one was very painful to do.
Yes.
Okay, so then didn't come out to legal.
And that was all I did.
Yeah,
That's what I wanted to do. And I really don't think anybody.
Yeah, but I prefer to be more. No, I prefer to be more.
Yeah, no, of course.
See, this voice.
It's such a good voice.
Everyone I interview in the book, without exception, talks about this voice.
Until I got my first couple of tattoos, this was a purchase place in Oversby Road. And he had,
Someone said
for the record, B-U-R-C-H-E-T-T. He's retired now, and his father was a tattooist before him at the same place. And he had some photographs that I was looking through, and there were 3 or 4 men in pictures who had pierced nipples. And here's some of them, and one of them pierced nose. And there was a couple of photographs of people with pierced forceps.
Some of them might have been clients, but I'd also bet money that some of them were from either
About
the
3
Minions
years.
collection or the Scoose collection, because they would buy those images.
I saw.
So we'll have that playing, you can come and listen to it, but that is the recorded interview that Jim Ward did with Mr. Sebastian in 1978. So why is there this windmill here? Because Mr. Sebastian Allen and his lifelong partner, Noel Arnold, lived in this windmill that during the time that Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and a bunch of other movies, like if you go back and watch that movie, Mr. Sebastian's living in there with his gay lover, when it's still like they both would have lost their jobs as school teachers being gay there.
It's funny because even in, so there's some film footage there as well. He was interviewed for quite a few films. He was, quite confident in front of the camera. But whenever he's quite prim and reserved and British, even when he's completely naked.
Totally.
Doesn't lose its Britishness.
Yeah, and he was, and a lot of, as we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of his piercing and certainly a lot of his tattooing practice was kind of born out of a kind of cautiousness, the conservatism. He wasn't, although tattooing was part of his sexual appetite, he didn't sexually enjoy tattooing and piercing, he wasn't turned on, he wasn't a sort of sadist who enjoyed hurting customers. And it's really interesting to kind of, again, for the reasons we'll talk about in a second, perhaps, but he's a very careful, intellectual, sensitive guy. Even when he's completely butt naked.
Well, he's handsome, he's
Yeah.
successful, and he has
He's
the tip to his
educated.
knees.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I'm naked, what about it?
What about it?
So I really want you to some point come over and look at these gorgeous ceramics that he's
They're
made.
beautiful.
You see the 7 deadly sins. They've never been exhibited.
No one has
before.
seen these except for Jeremy, me and Paul until this week.
There's a sun that's dated 1966, the year that I was born. And you can just see like the raw talent that he had. This is the only painting we have of his in the exhibit. And it's called Sailor's Thigh, so he's like shaved away.
I don't know about any of his flash sheets, like his painted flash sheets. He definitely had some. George Bone's got something like that, but smaller.
Simon says that he has a box of stuff, but it did not sound remarkable. My guess is that, for us, I think it's like correspondence and stuff.
Because there's some of that in the in that hymn magazine. There's a sheet of his flash article, but black and white.
I always wondered, we just don't.
Yeah.
Where is it? I'm guessing if it's anywhere, Simon has it.
Yeah.
So, this piece called Sailor's Thigh. For those that may not be as familiar with my culture, the rose is often a symbol for the anus. And of course, a snake is symbolic for a penis.
What?
So what you're seeing is butt sex, called Sailor's Thigh. What's really fun is there's actually pubic hair embedded into this around the fringe. Yeah, it's nuts.
And so Sebastian basically decides that he wants to learn to tattoo, and he's going to orgies, SM orgies. There's a kind of very loose network. There was a great club in London called the London Wrestling Club, which is a place where guys went to get beaten up if they were into that. But as part of that,
Not learn the art of self-defense.
Yeah. Piercing was part of the kind of menu of things that were happening at those events. Not always with jewelry insertion, like a lot of clay piercing, a lot of breadboarding and things like that. Alan was kind of upset that it wasn't being done sanitarily, it wasn't being done safely.
It looked barbaric. Too.
Yeah, and he was like, look, I want to figure out how to, so he even says in the PFIQ article, like, I never wanted a navel piercing, but I had to figure out how to do it.
Yep.
So he was sort of driven out of this kind of curiosity and concern. He had friends and tattoo clients that were doctors. So he was like, I'm going to figure out how to do this properly.
But that's the interesting thing, like, put the brakes. Even though we haven't done the deep history in this tour, we've shown you lots of piercing going on in the UK, but he's got no connection to it. Other than like the hack stuff that he's seen at the SM parties, like, he doesn't know any people that are competent in piercing.
Even though he was tattooed by George Bone, who was tattooed by Rich Mingus. Even though he was tattooed by Leslie Burchett, who is involved in those same scenes. Like there's this weird little break that happens sometime in the mid-50s, where this early 60s, where this stuff.
Some of it had to be sexuality.
Yeah.
So like P. Booth, if you read between the lines, I would bet every penny in my pocket is a heterosexual man, and he's piercing women. Like it's a different scene. So then you're introducing gay man, gay scene. Like yes, you can be cordial and you can get tattooed at shops, but you're not going to get real into sexuality stuff with someone that you presume, anyways, is heterosexual.
How much of that missing do you think, like misconnections, do you think was like playing your cards close to your chest and not being like
100?
Yeah, all of it. Yeah.
Well, technology too. Like it's just got the internet now. I'll Google this in incognito and find out what's going. Like
totally.
no, like it just.
I mean, like also in Sebastian's archives, there are pictures of very openly straight, very famous tattooers that are in their pants at clearly quite gay events. So there's obviously some crossover happening.
Sure.
All the straight tattooers really respected Sebastian, but he wasn't stealing because he wasn't stealing their client base. He had his own little client base pockets that he got on with tattooing. In fact, if they had clients come in that wanted genital tattooing, they'd send them to him. If they wanted genital tattooing themselves, they'd go to him. So there's not a kind of, certainly not until the 80s or early 90s, there's not a kind of like hostility towards him, at least not in the mainstream centre of the industry. I'm sure there were people that were against him, but
I don't want to forget, just so you know, Barry Kay also did photo shoots with Lex Winters, also did photo shoots with the Schublers, okay, and Barry Kay will mean something to you in a few minutes.
So
gorgeous photos of them.
So Sebastian basically, like he's getting tattooed, he's starting to kind of figure out piercing on his own, but he wants to know more.
And the only connection that he has, other than like doctors telling him some hygiene stuff, is like the Americans, which is so crazy to me. Like you had to go to America to learn how to pierce and tattoo, and I really think it's because of the gay connections.
100%.
So in 1976, he quits his job. He also gets some money from the book sales, the rights usage of his images in Doug Malloy's book, The Art of Pierced Penises. I think it was just a way of Doug trying to not have Mr. Sebastian feel bad, still Alan, not feel bad about accepting a plane ticket over. Like, I'm going to sell this book, make this money. Doug was a fucking millionaire. He didn't have to like sell the book to make the money for a plane ticket. But this way, there's reciprocity. Your images are helping to pay for this
some of
flight.
his teacher's salary, like his kind of redundancy money.
Because he was over for a while. He was over long enough to learn how to tattoo from Sailor Sid, from Cliff Rabin, and from Dave Slack in New York. And I love this because we're seeing like two nipple shots. This is Dave Slack, and of course that's Mr. Sebastian. All three gay tattoo artists. And then for the piercing, he goes out to the West Coast. He goes out and he sees Doug Malloy in Los Angeles, and he meets Doug Malloy for dinner. Unfortunately, I do interview Jim Ward in the book about that night, and unfortunately, Jim doesn't have a really clear memory on it. But here's the thing, why would he? He remembers everything around Doug, because he was meeting Doug for dinner. Jim Ward wasn't a piercer yet. And you know what? This dude over from England, Alan, wasn't a
This
piercer
is
yet.
like 1976, yeah.
So it's 1976. Alan's not a piercer yet. Jim's not a piercer yet.
No one's a piercer yet.
They're just, except for the master piercer, Doug Malloy. So they're both there with the master piercer, Doug Malloy. They're not on each other's radars yet. It's the weirdest thing. They only meet twice. They meet 1976, and then they meet in 1978 when Jim does the interview, and they're now brand new little starlets in the piercing world because they're like the two first professional piercers.
And they're saying to each other, like, how do you do this? How do I do this? How do I figure this out? What do you know? What do I know? Like, they both say separately and together, like, we were just...
The needle receiving tube, Mr. Sebastian. Now you'll hear that it's a gauntlet innovation because what happened was they, Mr. Sebastian, I actually got to use one. He developed a short tube, and it wasn't a needle receiving tube. It would be more like a needle insertion tube, because what you would do is you would take that, you put the tube, you could do it a couple of different ways. You could put the tube inside the urethra, short tube, and then like put the needle in and pierce, or I learned that you could like kind of like load them both together, and then you're piercing inside out, and that's how you're doing the piercing. Jim looked at them like, he's like, that's a great idea, but I could do it better. And the way you do it better is you make it longer, and then you can see everything you're doing. You're piercing outside in, into the tube, and when you take the tube off, you've already cleared the urethra. But it was that initial design that he saw and he knew he could do better. Same thing with this isn't this tour, but the internally threaded barbell. Gauntlet didn't invent that, Tattoo Sammy did. But it was really rough. It was the roughest prototype. And Jim's like, great, but I'm a fucking jeweler and I work in gold and I can make a bomb ass barbell. So he makes it really beautiful. Mirror finish and all that. So
Sebastian comes back to England, starts a tattoo studio with a bit of sort of piercing on the side, basically.
Yes, and it's actually like, have you ever heard of Mr. S? The original Mr., which was a fetish shop, the original Mr. S was Alan Selby's shop. Alan Selby was English, opened in London, then he moved it to San Francisco. So the very first shop that Alan started piercing and tattooing at was Mr. S. Before it was called Mr. S. It was like Leather, etc. or something. Leather. So, yeah, isn't that weird?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been really fun telling Mr. S, the company, because I'm friends with all those folks, like, by the way, do you have any idea how important you are to piercing history? So 1976 is recognized as the first real tattoo convention. It happens in Houston. And Sailor Sid's there, and like piercings are out, and nobody really cares. And, like,
Again, because all these people, these are the same people. They all know each other, right?
Together,
like, yeah.
People are taking their piercing equipment would be like ear piercing guns. Maybe it's getting used on other parts of the body. Who knows? But they're ear piercing guns. And tattooing and ear piercing, like there was a lot more. I've written down the percentage for that Tattoo Sammy article.
Yeah.
It's a crazy percentage of tattoo artists that are advertising the service. Not like that might do it on the download, but they're actually advertising ear piercing service. So anyway, so that's 76. Sailor Sid's like, oh my God, this is amazing. Doug, you gotta come. The Gauntlet's just opened. Doug's super excited about his other new friend, this guy named Roland Loomis, who becomes Fakir Mushavar. And he's like, hey guys, let's just go. Reno's really close. Let's just go to Reno. It's right next door in the state of Nevada. And Fakir, you'll be the entertainment. He provided the evening entertainment as Fakir Mushavar doing his side show.
That's when he sort of came out.
That was his coming out, which was, it was when the persona, if you remember the tours from 2019 in the lecture, Fakir, he structured his psyche as different and his play as different personas, and that was when the Fakir Mushavar persona, out of all these other personas, becomes the dominant persona. Before that, he was still Roland. So Roland's there doing his thing, and Gauntlet is doing their first convention and piercing, and they're getting a lot of buzz. And this guy you may have heard of, Don Ed Hardy, won Tattoo Artist of the Year. And at their closing party, which was their business meeting, he's like, you know, we all really want to see tattooing become socially acceptable. We're getting press here. as you notice, the press is being attracted to all this piercing stuff. We don't really feel that this is keeping with the brand. Like, we want tattooing to be socially accepted and not distracting.
And Hardy
as well.
So that story doesn't really hold water. What seems more likely is Hardy was very pragmatic, business oriented. He was interested in history. He's the reason we know about Sailor Jerry, for example, because he was publishing. But he's never had his hands tattooed. He has one tattoo on his neck that comes slightly out of his shirt collar. But he was, as I said earlier on as well, like tattooing had been made illegal in New York City in 1965 after hepatitis outbreak. Just tattooing was, was not very socially acceptable. It made it hard to
They
make money.
really wanted to make it mainstream. They didn't want it to be like just associated with bikers anymore, and they didn't want it, and
This period gets called like the tattoo renaissance in the literature, which isn't really justifiable. In fact, there was an article about Cash Cooper in the TV show in the 1950s called the Tattoo Renaissance, 20 years earlier. So, because tattooing doesn't just go away and come back, tattooing's always been there, but that moment is definitely a step, particularly driven by Hardy actually, and by Lyle Tuttle. And
the
by
intellectuals of tattooing.
Yeah, and by Lyle Hardy in the UK a few years later, which are really kind of trying to move tattooing in a different direction, and like all this stuff is kind of bad for business.
So they pass, and it passes, and like some of it is like, yeah, we agree with you, Ed. We don't think that this is good for the brand of tattooing, the image of tattooing. But some of it, as I've also heard recently, was some of these people, it's actually Tattoo Sammy writes about this. Tattoo Sammy writes about the fact that it's not all this prurient, we don't want piercing because it's gross. It's like, the gauntlet is competition. We don't want the competition there. We're making some side hustle money, literally, like Tattoo Sammy was writing about this. All these tattoo artists that are making the side hustle money don't want that jeopardized by this piercing company. So it was a combination of those two is what created the overwhelming majority that, we're not gonna have piercing, which kept it out for over 15 years. No piercing, you couldn't enter tattoo contests with any visible piercings, you couldn't be on the floor having your piercings exposed. It was like a thing, except it hadn't taken effect. In 77 it passed, but these guys didn't get the memo, and they're like, let's go to the tattoo convention. And so they go over to Amsterdam, and this time Doug's taken, Sailor Sid's going, Jim Ward's going, everyone's going. The irony is,
I think Lyle Hardy was at that show as well in '78.
Lyle Hardy was there.
Yeah.
These photos that were taken by Charles Gatewood, if you remember the Charles Gatewood exhibit, everyone was fucking there, and it was a terrible convention. They lost the convention space, they had the hustle, they weren't even sure it was going to happen. They had to literally pass the hat to get the money to pay for another hall that was not even as, it was a hangout space. So it was everyone that writes about it, including Sailor Sid's the convention was a shit show, but oh my God, we had so much fun meeting everyone. Because this is where PFIQ and Jim Ward and the Gauntlet, they get the interview with Mr. Sebastian. They meet the Schublers. All these people start coming.
How do you pronounce her name? Vince?
Schubler?
No, Vince. Elizabeth, what's her name?
If you were German, it would be Weinzer.
Weinzer.
But it's the W is pronounced, so it's Weinzer. I'm sure if she
was
was
the tattoo grandma from Portland, Oregon.
Yeah, award-winning tattoo grandma, tattooed by Burt Graham, all these other people. But also, we've got pictures of her from at least the early '60s, hanging out with Roland Loomis.
Really?
Yes, when her husband was still alive. They're great photos. They're show some great photos hanging out, and they're all just hanging out, taking photos of each other. Because her husband Rudolph was a really good photographer too, and of course Roland was. Anyways, it's not these weird. If you take away nothing else, it's not these weird, unrelated. We are starting to connect the dots. We're seeing how all these histories intersect. And Alan Oversby isn't Mr. Sebastian yet. The first time they meet, which is they only meet 2 times, the first time they meet, neither one of them are piercers or a tattoo artist for that matter. Like they were just, so like.
And the fact they don't know anything is sort of what they're talking about, right? They're like, why don't we know anything about this stuff?
Doug is the master piercer at this point. Doug is who they're getting.
Doug is making all the bullshit up that you and I spend our lives trying to fix.
Most of it Doug just makes up.
Yeah, because no one knows anything, so they just literally make up. Like, anything you've ever heard about piercing history that's not from either of us is wrong. It's not true. I'm slightly over-egging that. I'm slightly over-egging that, but that's basically true. Right?
A lot of it's not, it's really not. So, so now Doug's excited, and he's paying for Roland to go to the place to Reno, and he's paying for Jim Ward to go to Reno. Jim Ward.
Alan's been made redundant from being a school teacher, so he uses his redundancy money to come as well.
Totally.
Yeah.
Oh wait, was he in? I don't think he was in Reno. I think he was in.
No, he didn't get to Reno. Sorry, he came to the US. Yeah.
That was that '76 trip, where he learned everything and took it back. So then Reno happens, and Don Ed Hardy wins Tattoo Artist of the Year that year. So he's got some clout. People like recognize, like, to even get that award, before you get that award, you have to have a certain amount of status. Then you get that award, you get a lot of status. Closing meeting at the end of it, he's like, there sure is like a lot of piercing going on here, and we're trying to legitimize tattooing. I don't think that piercing has any place in tattooing. Can we get a motion that we don't allow piercing anymore? And that 1977 conference locked out piercing for more than a decade.
2 decades.
Yeah. Well, no, more than a decade.
Yeah.
Till the early 90s.
Yeah. That's
So-
2 decades. 76 to 90s is 2 decades, Paul.
Yeah, but it's like 1990.
Okay.
So 15
Decade and a
years.
half. Let's put the difference.
All right, yes, got it. So, but like leading up to it, like all of these people, like, you know, like you'll see correspondence and like the magazines where they'll say like, I'm bringing my piercing kit to Reno. These are other tattoo artists. So like some people have thought that perhaps part of it was like outrage. Oh my God, this is outrageous.
Yeah, that's the story that gets told, but it isn't that.
But the other part of the story is, these guys are taking all my business.
Yeah.
Which is also really interesting. So it was also a way of like blocking the competition.
This is a moment in tattoo history that gets called erroneously, again read my book, called the tattoo renaissance. Like tattoos coming back out of nowhere. That isn't true. Ed wouldn't even make that claim. You know, Ed gets rightly hailed as this amazingly pivotal, important figure.
Huge.
For so many reasons. But yeah, like part of it is this kind of, one of the things that's happening is this kind of attempt to legitimize and basically just turn into a money making thing, make money again, right?
So 77 happens and that gets passed, but it hasn't really taken too much effect yet. In 78, we now have an international tattoo convention that's happening, and so they take the party to Amsterdam, which is where this next tattoo convention's happening. So they go to London first, and they get to see Alan's first shop, which is where the interview happens, because now they're both piercers. Now
Which is inside a leather works shop. That one? No.
Oh God, no, it's not Leatherworks. It's I want to say Image Leather, but it's on here. I swear, it's on the banners. I swear, it's on the banners. But the money. This is one of the things that's really interesting to me. Jim Ward's money to start the gauntlet came from Doug Malloy. Alan Oversby's money to become Mr. Sebastian and open his first shop came from Doug Malloy.
Yeah.
So he may have had a problem with the truth or what have you, but hugely instrumental in getting both of these men off the ground in their careers, and then of course what becomes an industry afterwards. So the irony is, the fucking tattoo conference was a shit show. Like, it was a disaster. They almost got kicked out of the hotel because the rooms weren't selling. They did get kicked out of the hotel because the rooms were selling. They had to change venues. It almost didn't happen. It was just chaos and disorganized. But it didn't matter because what happened is all these people came together. This is where we see like the Schwublers that are also talked about in PFIQ.
Elizabeth Wurtz.
Weinzel, who's like considered like the tattoo grandma, and she's hanging out with Alan Oversby, and Sailor Sid's hanging out. Like, they're all coming together, taking these great photos, doing these interviews that get into PFIQ that are further promoting these people and bringing together community. What else? Oh, and these photos were taken by Charles Gatewood. So if you've been around a long time, you've even seen the Charles Gatewood exhibit that we had years ago. He was an amazing photographer. The book Modern Primitives was originally supposed to be about like Charles Gatewood and his friends. And of course, you know, fuck here, how could that not steal the spotlight? Same thing with Dances Sacred and Profane. It was originally supposed to be a documentary about Charles Gatewood. If you watch it, that's why, like,
Yeah, it starts off as a documentary.
yeah, it's a train wreck of a like looking at it from a cinematographer standpoint, like.
Also, Gate was drunk all the time, so his
Yeah, it was a train wreck. Like it just the story, like it's two movies that like clash together. It's very historically important. But you see the Charles Gatewood documentary, and then like, oh, it's now the Fuck Here movie. It like just totally changes direction. So hugely important. Not a particularly great convention. Anything else you want to say about
I was
that?
about to say, I think one of the reasons why this is happening is that tattooing had been made illegal in New York in 1965.
That is correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So tattooing had been made illegal in New York in 1965 after a hepatitis outbreak. Gatewood was there, actually, like taking photos with Spiderweb a bit later on.
In the 70s,
In
when
the
they were being
70s.
provoked. I just did a whole interview, and there's going to be a chapter coming out in Clayton Patterson's new book on that scene.
Yeah, but particularly in the US, tattooing's
Sorry.
getting a bad rap at this point. Also, it's linked in with the counterculture movement and Vietnam and all the political stuff that's happening. And so, and Ed is super clean cut, right? He has
Yes.
he has no tattoos in his hands. He's got a tiny little like neck tattoo at this point coming up out of his shirt that was so shocking in London that Lal hardly recognised him across the street. But Ed was really a kind of savvy guy, and he really wanted tattooing to be taken seriously. And I think it's in the context of that moment in the late 60s, early 70s of why this is happening.
Yeah. I've also just done recently some writing around how Tattoo Semi is going to work into that. We'll announce it on the archive when that comes out. But like, Tattoo Semi was hugely respected at this time in the tattoo community. He was like, you know, winning awards and whatnot. And he's like, when they created this like no piercing at conference, he's like, that's outrageous.
He's here. Cliff and Sammy both get tattoos.
Yeah, and Sammy's publicly putting out like pamphlets that he's handing out to people, asking them to vote on this. Like, do you think this is outrageous? What are your feelings on this? I think this is outrageous. Tattooing and piercing have always gone together. So anyways, but that's a whole thing.
Did they ever link the hepatitis outbreak to the tattoo?
Yeah, I don't know the story, but yeah, basically it was a tattoo outbreak.
Was it like the daughter of the mayor or something?
Yeah, it was and tattooing was illegal. If you think it's tattooing was illegal in New York from 1965 to 1997. It was like illegal in New York for 22 years.
Yeah.
1997?
Yeah, you
That
couldn't
late,
legally get tattooed in New York until 1997.
Were all these tattoo studios everywhere? Yeah.
Was every New York cop tattooed? Yes.
Spiderweb took this is what we covered in the interview. One of the things. Spiderweb took Annie Sprinkle to the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Then they had
he called the police. All right, come quickly.
It was Veronica Vera was the outraged public role. She calls and she goes, "I'm outraged. This is offensive. These people are here breaking the law," trying to get the police, and the police were like, "Oh, we are not touching that," because they had also sent a press release before they had done this to say, we're going to be tattooing on the steps of the Met, we're going to get arrested, and we're going to challenge it. So the police never showed up. They're like, we know.
And then they did it again, and they did get arrested. It went to the Supreme Court.
When did that happen?
That happened in 1976, 77, something like that.
That's true. And who was this?
They did it twice. So it wasn't with, that one wasn't with.
Yeah, I don't think it was with Annie.
No, that was with Shadow, his apprentice.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
Spiderweb, another really interesting, weird, polarizing figure in tattoo history.
Yeah, they need help with their archive too.
Do they?
That's an aside. Yeah, we'll talk later about that. He's not doing so well. He's not.
I know. He was never all there to stop it.
Well, it's clinically not all there. So this is going to tell you a lot of the story that we just told you. So I'm not going to go deep into it, but it tells you about the dinner party, and you can dive in there again. We're going to move in here.
Woohoo! Yeah.
So this is the wild area. We're
Buy the book. They told me to say that.
I did. It's true. We still have some copies available. You're welcome to take a look at it. If you don't know this about tattoo books, they sometimes linger, then they all sell out, and then the prices get crazy.
Yeah.
So I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. Once it's gone, like, it will.
So by this point, right, so Sebastian is now basically the first, certainly kind of openly visible body piercer in the UK. He is tattooing a pretty much exclusively gay male client base. Although, and again, like the other tattooers in London know him, like him, certainly don't feel threatened by him because he's not seeing their customers. In fact, a lot of them, if they ever get someone coming in who wants their dick tattooed, they're like, go to Sebastian, please. I'm not doing that. So he's like a kind of, he's not like, basically, again, he's like, he was tattooed by the biggest names of his generation, and then by the mid to late 70s, he's got a pretty steady client base of the kind of customers that he wants to tattoo. And in his photo archive that Jeremy's got, nearly every single photo is of a man. There's one or two pictures of women, but not many. He's tattooing a lot of genitals, a lot of buttholes. Writing on the back, honestly, there's some beautiful tattooed buttholes that he writes on the back. Such a shame, he had such a nice butthole, which is really like this, but it's what he would have wanted. He is, just sort of doing his thing. His studio is amazing, like he's got butt plugs out on the shelf, like pictures of his cocks when you went in. It was on Mount Pleasant, which is where the main Royal Mail sorting office was, sort of pretty much in the centre of town. But sort of hidden away, it wasn't like a street front studio. And he was kind of getting on with doing his thing and piercing increasingly as well. I think probably certainly in the 70s, making most of his money tattooing more than piercing, right?
He would work in the piercings around his tattooing. And Jeremy made it sound like, and also Simon, who we'll talk about in a minute, made it sound like he had a fairly, he was busy. He was busy. He was busy, and he would work those piercings in around his tattoo.
Because tattooing is part of the gay scene at this moment in time, and piercing is becoming that. Certainly the kind of leather, kinkier ends of the scene. Loads of his photography is on men you wouldn't know were tattooed or pierced if you saw them in their pants. They're completely tattooed and genital pierced, but otherwise invisible, most of them. So it's, again, a real kind of amazing piece of tattoo history that's pretty much invisible. Like, you don't kind of imagine, when you think of 70s tattooing, you're not thinking of like middle-aged men with their dicks tattooed. Because it's not been seen, it's not been published, because these photos have been in Jeremy's
but it was happening.
Safety, but it was happening. And it was happening, and as I said, everyone in the industry knew it was happening.
Yeah, it just wasn't talked about. It wasn't at least not publicly talked about. These are some of the more risque works that are done by Nigel Kent. He's the author, he's the artist rather, that did this actual beautiful print of Mr. Sebastian. That then the flyer that he used for a flyer for when he was appearing in Amsterdam to tattoo. And it's just to show you an example of some of the work.
And Rob is a fetish shop.
Yes, and it's actually still there.
Still there?
Yeah. Not to be confused with Mr. Ronald. Mr. Ronald is one of the 2 official apprentices that Mr. Sebastian ever had. Mr. Ronald, I don't know what year that he passed away from AIDS, but he's no longer with us, and I don't have a lot of history on him. A couple of Dutch interviews that I found, but in a photograph or 2, there's just not a lot on Mr. Ronald. But that cigar box over there, that was painted by him, and it was originally a gift to Mr. Sebastian, that then ended up in the collection of Franco B., who's a performance artist, who loved his that, and also Mr. Sebastian's style collar that Franco B. put in acrylic, because he's an artist, and he can do that sort of thing. He was making art. So, are we all mature adults here?
Yeah.
I'm an immature adult, is that okay?
I'm still 12.
All right, so this is problematic perhaps by today's standards, but I'm going to give you a little story now and try and put it in the context of time and place. So it's really easy for us to have certain feelings about things now that aren't appropriate now, but just remember, like, this is a different time and place. The place Matt's already started to describe to us. It's a private studio. You had to call for an appointment.
That's that photo there. It's like wood panels. Yeah, you can see here, right? So it's got this small single room.
And you're welcome to browse through the book. Like, there's wild stories in there, like, you know, like after hours, like perhaps, you know, you'd have friends come by and they would have sex or what have you. So it was like, it wasn't like this APP branded shop where like you are signing this contract that this room is made for piercing only and nothing else happens in this. Like, it was his office. It was his home away from home. It might be where he has sex with some friends after hours. It's the 70s. That's what you did in the 70s. Something else that you might do in the 70s is if you were flirting, again, not appropriate by today's standards, but things were different. Even when I got into it, things were more gray. And in the 80s, it was only gray. You know, like, people would flirt, you'd have conversations, you're holding genitals in your hands. Again, different time, different standards of acceptability. So you might like get to flirting with someone, and they might feel like there's a little connection going on here. And Mr. Sebastian had a lot of fetishes, and when you start seeing some of the photographs, you'll see that one of them is garters.
Sock suspenders.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you like my suspenders that I'm wearing? Do you want to put some on? It's like, oh, okay, put them on. And next thing you know, he's taking photographs of you. He's asking, but maybe you're now wearing a pair of underwear that he has meticulously hand-stitched the fly in the front. Oh, but he also meticulously hand-stitched the fly in the back because he's a fetishist. Like, he didn't buy them this way. He literally bought them and modified them because he was an artist. And, you know, like, sometimes you have to, like, shave arms and whatnot to do a tattoo. Well, sometimes you don't necessarily have to shave the pubic area if you're not doing a pubic tattoo, but maybe you're going to ask anyways, hey, do you mind if I shave your pubic area? And certainly if you're getting pubic wings, he's going to have to shave it. Well, he would take the pubic hair and he would stuff them into pillows.
No way.
And these are clients' pillows that you would be lying on when you were getting your tattoo
Full
on.
of pubic hair?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
And if you look at it, this one has a little garter.
So many of the photos are men in sock suspenders and pants with holes cut in the front.
Yeah.
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 That's amazing.
So welcome to the world of fetish.
Yeah.
Sorry?
What is it?
It's nice. Yeah,
Is it
it's
comfy?
nice.
Yeah.
It's nice.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's also worth pointing out, you know, something we said a minute ago, like, this is also part of his sexuality. So he
100%.
He also says that he doesn't get turned on by doing piercing or tattooing. So he's quite clear about that.
Yeah.
It's not part of his, he's not actively kind of sadistic and enjoying doing it in that way.
A bartender doesn't get served on by serving you drinks, but you might start flirting with your bartender.
Yeah, but he certainly fancies tattooed men. He prefers tattooed men to non-tattooed men.
And that's what I forgot. So the whole thing about like he doesn't actually get turned on by piercing, I don't believe that he did get turned on by piercing. He used anesthesia for a reason.
Yeah.
He would use anesthesia on clients because he felt that those things were registered as painful and he didn't want to cause discomfort to his clients. So he's not a sadist, as this is going to...
This becomes important in a minute.
Yeah, he's not a sadist, and he was concerned about clients' comfort. And it wasn't like... And even if it was, but it wasn't, in his case, it wasn't a particularly... Piercing wasn't a particularly a fetish.
And there were tattooers in London at the time, one in particular, who was... If you've seen those photos of the London skinheads with their heads tattooed, most of those were done by a tattooer who was quite predatory, who was finding and basically abusing underage teenage boys, because that was what he got off on.
This is not that story.
Yeah, this is not that story.
This is not that story.
Yeah.
So, you know, what we have is the treasure trove of what's left. This is all that we have left. We've even tried to, he had a life partner that I apologize, we just haven't gotten to because we've been talking about so much. Noel Arnold, very modern relationship. They were the ones that lived together in the windmill, but also, and he was always there. He was always in the Shropshire, he was always in the country.
Yeah.
But Mr. Sebastian moves to the London, and he has London lovers, but he's always had this connection to Noel Arnold, who wasn't kinky, who wasn't into all this. Like, he had met him before right after his first tattoo.
Yeah.
He had a star on his hand, but right after that, and he had his nipples pierced, but Noel was square. They were both school teachers. So he has this long, varied life. We weren't able to track down Noel, and this is literally just all we have left. And it gives you a glimpse into the fetish that he enjoyed, the attire. He loved his corsets. And then I do want you guys to come back and look at some of these custom piercing jewelry that you'll see right here. It's amazing. Why is there a leather punch in here? Well, as you saw in the picture next door, he would do septums and he would do guiches with a leather punch. Weights, urethral sound for play. In this booklet, you'll find lots of stuff that I'll encourage you to read. Reflection by Alan's partner. This was actually read at his memorial. So there's a lot of memorial tributes,
Again, all from
articles.
Jeremy's collection.
Yep. And I would encourage you guys, like, when you get a chance to flip through that, and you'll learn lots more about Alan there. Books that he's appeared in, of course, The Pierced Penis is one we talked about. Dirty Squad.
Yeah, wait, that's a good segue to what happens next. Yeah. So, okay, so then basically HIV happens, right? AIDS happens, it panics the tattoo industry. George Bone told me that basically, like, he thought that every tattooer in the country was going to have HIV because they'd been sharing needles, essentially. He said George would tell me you'd want to go to the get tattooed at the beginning of the month because that's when tattooers change their needles. Right?
When you read, like, the magazines at the time, the Tattoo International.
How to tattoo guides said don't reuse your needles because it's too expensive.
Yeah, and there were also, like, you see, like, where, like, AIDS starts appearing in every issue.
Oh yeah. So there's a
really
huge panic, right? In the early 80s, the tattoo industry in Britain gets really split because they're like, how are we going to deal with this? So gloves and autoclaves and hygiene comes in, of course, and then there's a lot of, so the tattoo industry has got its own internal magazines that are being, not published officially, but are being shared around the community. And there are huge conversations of, like, a lot of it very homophobic, and just awful. And actually, to the credit, a younger generation of tattooers, including people like Lal Hardy and Lionel Titchener, who runs the Tattoo Club of Oxford, basically saying, like, look, tattooing's meant to be weird. We can't, like, ban gay customers. How do we know? How can we tell? Like, there's loads of gay tattooers, like, stop this, right? And there's a bit, there's obviously kind of that homophobia. But that changes tattooing around the world, like, pretty much forever, right? It's why we have gloves. It's why we have autoclaves. It's why we have single-use needles. But in the context of that, what also happens is a case called Operation Spanner.
Would you mind, because this is going to take, I'm going to have to stand here
Yeah.
for a really long time
Yeah.
that I'm not going to want to.
Yeah.
Let's do a reveal, and then we're going to have you talk about Operation Spanner.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about this artwork really quick,
Good, 'cause
and
I'll be there
then
for ages.
we're going to do Operation Spanner.
Yeah.
When you, don't even do so.
Oh yeah, sorry.
When you get a chance, you're going to check out this ceramic egg.
Amazing.
And it's a ceramic egg that's gold glazed, that's with 2 pierced nipples on a chest. This was a gift that Mr. Sebastian made in 1977 for Doug Malloy. That Doug, because he was also living a very closeted type lifestyle, didn't want to have it in his house, so he gave it to Jim Ward to hang on to. And thank God, because Doug's family destroyed his entire archive when he passed away, and that's the only reason why we have this and the only reason why it survived. Yeah, so lucky. Now we're getting to my favorite piece in the entire exhibit.
It's one of my favorite pieces of tattooing ever.
Ever.
Yeah.
And I believe it's the idealized, stylized concept itself
Oh, yeah.
of Mr. Sebastian. It's a self-representation. and I'll let you guys look at it because it's fucking mind-blowing.
Again, like, so I got a tip off that Jeremy had all this stuff, and when it went around his house, and this was just wrapped up in tissue paper in a box. I was like, wow, this is amazing. So I'm glad that people are seeing it.
That's unreal.
Happening in British and kind of global cultural life at that time. HIV is one. Another one is the satanic panic. This idea that like Satanists are this stuff that's coming back right now, right? Like the idea that Satanists are murdering children. There's a real panic around videotapes in the UK. So we have a law that comes in 1984 called the Video Nasties Act, the Home Recording Act, which bans a lot of films, including like major important cultural films like The Exorcist and Clockwork Orange, as well as Driller Killer, Cannibal Holocaust. So there's a real kind of panic around videotapes. And also, importantly, the British Obscene Publications Squad, that used to be called the Vice Squad, the part of the Metropolitan Police that were in charge of like stopping pornography, had embarrassed themselves at the end of the 70s and got caught out basically kind of being very corrupt and involved with organised crime in Soho, the kind of sex shop area of London. So they were disbanded and they reformed as the Obscene Publications Squad, who were kind of looking for a way to make themselves look better. And basically, a number of gay men had been murdered, some in the context potentially of sadomasochistic play. So a guy called John Hudspeth was killed on Hampstead Heath, kicked to death. The story goes that he asks him, like, it's a cruising spot, still to this day. The story goes that he asked these guys to like beat him up because he was into it, and he died. And there was a couple of other murders of gay men. Another guy whose murder was never solved, who essentially kind of disappeared one day, but was also thought to be an S&M'er. So there's a real kind of like moral panic, and they all intersect. In 1987, the Manchester police in the north of England arrest a guy.
87.
I said 87.
Oh, I thought you said 97.
No, did I? 87. Arrest a guy in Manchester. Probably, so not much, there's one article about this, but it's basically a guy called Chris Rogers, who was a local councillor, politically connected, and they found him in possession of child pornography. And they were about to kind of throw the book at him, and he said, hey, will you like cut me a deal if I hook you up to something bigger? And they were like, sure. So he gave them some videotapes. On these videotapes, basically it was scenes, home recordings of sadomasochism encoded into our pornography laws. It's encoded in domestic violence bill that just came in. So this idea that you can't, even if you want someone to hurt you, you can't let them, is a big part of the law. Now that's really ironic because in 1995, after the case happened initially, people were pretty outraged, right? It's the 90s, it's a kind of liberal period, everyone's kind of thinking, well, this doesn't feel right to us, you know, they've sort of been caught on a technicality. Huge review in which Alan's case was a huge centerpiece, because they were like, how can it be legal to pierce someone's ears, but not legal to pierce someone's penis? And so basically what happened is, it was decided that you could pierce somebody, but not for sexual purposes. How you define that, I don't know. Alan would go on to, do a lot of navel piercings. There's an amazing interview with a journalist from The Independent who basically says, like, oh yeah, I feel so sexy with my navel piercing. It's like, it's technically illegal. That gets changed in 2003 with the Sexual Offences Act. But basically, Alan's case becomes this kind of centerpiece of this review, where the law lords at the time and the society says, look, we should change this. This feels wrong. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. The men appeal, and they lose their appeal in a case called R versus Brown, which goes to the House of Lords in '94. They then appeal again up to the European Court of Human Rights, and they lose that appeal as well in 1997. So that their case remained case law from 97 onwards. And yeah, like after that, it's kind of deeply ironic because actually, because of the outcry for about 15 years, maybe 20 years, everyone realizes that that's kind of not really okay, and the police aren't interested in charging anybody. So the piercing industry kind of continues apace. Alan, becomes really pivotal in like piercing belly buttons on celebrities. It's that moment in the 90s when tattooing comes out of out of the shadows. But it's come out of the shadows into this mainstream kind of pop video supermodel moment from queer SM orgies. Mm-hmm. And in fact, some of those tapes, some of those spanner tapes, may have been, the tapes where he was trying to improve piercing, doing piercing. They were perhaps some of the things that ended up getting him arrested. So that's a kind of real shallow overview of the story, but it's incredibly. So it's a very weird niche piece of law, but it's the first thing that any British law student learns about consent. Sometimes the only thing that British law students learn about consent. It's an astonishing read, the judgment, and it's so kind of interesting because it encapsulates all of these weird things that are happening. So, the last thing I'll mention on that, I mentioned the satanic panic. The last thing that happens in this is kind of astonishing. So, that book, Dirty Squad, is by the head of the Vice Squad at the time, a guy called Michael Hames. He, basically, there was a documentary on Channel 4 in 1991, which basically purported to be the first real-life evidence of a satanic death cult, of a satanic sacrifice of a child. And it was going to be kind of revealed, We've been looking for this for ages, everyone said it didn't exist. Turns out we found evidence. So the film opens up with this anonymized survivor who sort of describes being in this basement, and being, witnessing this kind of ritual child murder. Detective Hames goes on this program and basically says, "Yeah, we're pretty sure this is legit. We're pretty sure this is real. This is evidence of a satanic murder, and we're going to kind of investigate it." That night, it very quickly becomes apparent that it's not a video, surprise, of a satanic death cult or a child murder. It's actually a performance art video that the channel that broadcast it had paid for a few years earlier. It's a video called First Transmission by Psychic TV. It features this amazing part of the film, which is a part of this music video by Psychic TV, who are a kind of art project music industrial group. It features Derek Jarman, the amazing queer British artist, filmmaker, in shadow with the voice performed by Mr. Sebastian. And this video shows a satanic priest at the altar, right? And it's Derek Jarman voiced by Mr. Sebastian. And yeah, basically, like, it turned out that this was a performance art video. It obviously wasn't a real video of an actual murder. It was something that the Channel 4 had paid for themselves. But so was the kind of energy and moral panic that a really sort of flagship major news program could put out this documentary with Mr. Sebastian in the middle of it as a serious piece of revelation. It's kind of astonishing.
Next section?
Next section.
All right.
Yes.
You guys have to come back for the first part.
Oh yeah.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay, we'll let you go.
And we're actually going to move through, I know, this is some fucking wild shit over here. It's really graphic, really intense.
Really beautiful.
Yes,
Yeah.
It's incredible. And yeah, and as you can imagine, really pushing the envelope, really shocking.
Really reflecting the kind of visual culture of
The two on either side are actually variations that are taken from Mr. Sebastian's flash as inspiration, and these were actually tattooed onto Jeremy's leg, onto his thigh.
These are reflecting the kind of visual culture of the queer press at the time, right? So Tom of Finland kind of stuff, but also stuff that's been published in Drama magazine. This very kind of beautiful, sensitive, stuff. And it's tattoo flash, right? And it's from the 1980s, and it's some of the most incredible tattoo flash I've ever seen. I love showing it to people because it just changes your opinion of what tattooing. Tattooing in the 80s, everyone's getting bulldogs tattoos, Tasmanian devils, or they're getting tattoos of, people with huge weights and Switzerland and buckle.
All right, so we'll all move into this room. If we can. I know there's a lot. You don't have to. Barry Kay. Oh my God, this is nuts. So I do a lot of interviews. Jim Ward and I have like a weekly, every Tuesday we meet, and we are processing his archive. We're giving the oral histories on every single object. And we get to this one image, and I apologize, it's actually not on display. And it's of him playing the harp in his, it's from this series where he's playing the harp in his San Vicente home in West Hollywood. And it's really iconic, it's beautiful. It's a different image than that. And do me a favor, delete that.
Oh, okay.
So these images, this room right here, like if you snapped pictures other places, not so bad. This room, we will get sued. They're very protective of this room. This room is the absolute, like, I can't look the other way. This will get us in trouble. No photographs in here. Both of these archives are very serious about their terms of usage. So, so Jim Ward's like, yeah, this guy Barry Kay took my picture. He's like, maybe you should he's got an archive somewhere, maybe you should track it down. So then I'm with Cleo Dubois.
Barry Kay's most famous for doing a book of trans women in Australia, a really amazing
He's
book.
Actually not most famous for that.
I would say that's what he's most famous for.
Photography-wise, what he's most famous for is Nureyev.
Oh yeah.
He did set and costume design for Nureyev, all the most famous operas, that is what Barry Kay is known for, is operatic set and costume design.
Like Rudolph Nureyev?
Yeah.
Okay.
His most iconic costumes and sets were done by this guy Barry Kay, who's just another one of these MacGyver artists, and he's got, I don't mean to be so flippant, but his boyfriend's like, here's a camera, why don't you go do some photography, have fun with it, you need a break from set design. So he goes to India and he takes all these crazy pictures. And he actually is a natural because he's an artist. He's from Australia, he goes to Australia, and I have the book for those if your area of study is trans. I'll show you this book from '76, which I do have here. And he does this book of trans folks, mostly trans women. Some of them are trans sex workers. And it's very provocative, very wild. But what he does, and again, this is the brilliance of Barry Kay's, it's not the shock exploitation. He interviews each of these people. It's done really respectful. It's done through the eyes of anthropology. He's an ethnographer. And there's nothing salacious about it. It's really getting into these folks and expressing them. And the book's even titled As a Woman. And the reason why is when he kept interviewing them over and over and over again, they would say, well, as a woman, and then da-da-da-da-da, here's my story, this is my experience. And he just noticed what you do in ethnography is sometimes you're looking for these word associations and whatnot. And he saw that this kept repeating, and that's why he chose it as the title. They basically named it himself. But to take a step back, so I'm at the Fakir Mushafar archive, and I'm going through stuff with Cleo, and I see this photo, and I'm like, I've seen enough of Fakir's photography. I know how he takes a picture, I know how he positions the tripod, I know what he likes with lighting and angles, and I'm like, that doesn't look anything for my eye, that is not a Fakir picture. And I flip it over and it says Barry Kay, and I'm like, okay Barry, you have my attention. You're not just you didn't just meet Jim Ward, and I didn't know anything about Barry at this time. I'm like, you've also got, and these are all from the 70s, and none of these photos have I seen published before. There's something here. So I'm able to track it down. It's 2019. I make an appointment to go to the archive in London. And no, it must have been 2020 is when the appointment was, because then COVID happened, and I didn't. And the world fell apart. And the next thing I call him up, I'm like, okay, it's safe to travel again. I'm coming to London. He's like, well, you're welcome to come to the archive, but I'm now in the south of Holland, and really the middle of nowhere in a castle. So you have to come to my castle. So I'm like, okay, I guess if I have to go to the castle. So I go to a castle, and there's like thousands of images. It's not just, for sure, it's like, Cliff Raven and Jim Ward and Fakir, and this is Viking Navarro again.
I spend my life looking for photos of all these people, and I've never seen any of these photos.
No. The visual dictionary, that book that's over there, actually uses Barry Kay's photos of Mr. Sebastian. And the other photos that are in there under the dictionary heading of piercing, those are all Barry Kay photos. So somewhere he knew the author of that and got permissions to use it in that book, but that's the only time I've come across them. So they were very generous, but again, they're very protective of their images. So we stumbled across this and all the stories, and again, it's in the book, the whole story about the archive there. Then we get to this cat, Stefan Richter, who, for those that don't know, like, I first came across Stefan Richter in this book, Hidden Exposures. Oh, sorry. And one of the things that's, like, first of all, the photos are incredible. Like, they're the most outlier of the outlier. All this was like late 80s, early 90s photos. He finally publishes it in 94. But one of the things that you'll notice is there's almost no faces. Everything's no names. Everything's very closeted, concealed, unidentifiable. Then he comes out with this book in 2017. And what he does is he brings everyone out of the closet. So now you're able to see their faces, and he gives you their photos. And look, it's Mr. Sebastian with the ceramics in his apartment.
So like people like Michael and Farrell have been like photographed a lot, like real feature of the British photo scene. Jack Young, if you know any of the Sean Porter stuff, all of his collection started off from Jack Young's collection. But yeah, like Stefan was, as you were saying, he was meeting people and photographing them. There was a real sort of spate of books in the like early 90s, like kind of basically in the aftermath of Modern Primitives really, and of the re-release of Ed Hardy's Tattoo Time. And you know, the kind of visibility of piercing and tattooing in the early 90s, which is when I was first paying attention to it, because these books were in Tower Records, they were in kind of like alternative bookshops at that moment in time.
And there's like 2 or 3 names, and we feature them here, that really push it. Like they're just how generative they were, like how much they put out. Stefan Richter was one of them. Chris Wroblewski. We show one of his earliest books from
the Skin Shows books, which you've ever seen those.
Which are amazing. And then Hoos Grandel, who will feature in the next one. But these are just for you to come back in, read the stories, get to learn some of our ancestors. These are our pioneers that were doing these incredible things. And no, that's not George Bush Sr.
So these two people are also pretty... So this is Genesis P. Orridge, who was the artist who made the film that I was just talking about that people thought was a snuff movie. In the aftermath of that, he fled the UK and came to the United States where he lived, and then they died 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, beginning of the pandemic.
Beginning.
Yeah. Jen died pretty recently. Jen's story is amazing as well. If you don't know their story, it's worth, again, like,
oh god, you have
swatting
to.
up.
Yeah.
The story of Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV and Topi and...
If you like electronic music or industrial, like all that, like, it's there. That's one of the main origins.
And then this is Alex Binney, who basically, like, art school student, obsessed with tattooing, came to the US to get tattooed by Leo Zulueta. Had been he was a sort of like middle class kid gone weird, basically, like from Oxfordshire. So he was tattooing his friends in squats. If you know the artist Grayson Perry, the British ceramicist, Alex and Grayson squatted together. Boy George was part of that scene.
Boy George, right before so it's right before Culture Club breaks big, because he's like, if you know anything about early Boy George, he had lots of manifestations in his look. This is literally the small fedora, dreads.
Late
Culture Club, right before they break big. Barry Kay does a photo shoot of him. Photos never published. I'm talking to the archive to hopefully talk to Boy George, because he'll lose his mind when he sees it. Like, there are holes in the bottom of his shoes, which is something that used to happen in the 80s.
Yeah.
As a kid in the 80s, you'd have these like fancy dress shoes and you'd wear them until there were holes in the bottom, and like you can see the holes in the bottom of Boy George's shoes. He had no money, and they're great photos.
Alex's wife also married Lee Bowery.
Nicola Bowery. So, all right, so I like to tell it in this way.
Yeah.
So, he's punk, like, but also, you know, he's like
Alex,
educated college punk.
he also says, so Alex is a really good friend of mine now. He's in his 60s, and he's like, I'm not gay, but I have to check.
Yeah, I know I'm not gay. And like, I kind of bust, in the book, I kind of bust his balls a little bit, because I've also known Alex for like 30 years. And so like, I'm like, there's some really interesting photos of you in Mr. Sebastian's.
Oh, yeah. And video.
Yeah, in Mr. Sebastian's archive, where you're like that Jeremy photo where you're just hanging out naked.
This
and,
is him with his cute butt.
Yeah, with his cute little butt. I'm like, so you're posing for like, do you want to like, I'm not gay. All right, but these are like really intimate photos. So one of the things that like blew my mind, so Alex, for those that don't know, he and Elaine Angel were married like in 1991, I think.
Yeah.
They met in like 1990, I think, at the Amsterdam Tattoo Convention, fell madly in love, and they got married. He then moves to California, where he meets like Leo Zuletto and all of his heroes.
Works at Ed Hardy's place, Hay City, for a while.
But he started tattooing when he landed in America at the Gauntlet, which is where I got a lot of my tattoos.
If you've ever seen like, well, that 90s black spiky tribal stuff, like he's a huge innovator in that, and he certainly brought it to the UK from Leo.
So, but before he married Elaine, he was tattooing out of the squat he lived in. And he had started tattooing because another one of these art students, he had been a client of Mr. Sebastian. So,
and he went to Sebastian because Sebastian was like, you know, like in the 90s certainly, right? Like
Genesis Purge was going there. Like that's like the stamp of approval. Genesis
it was
is
edgy and weird, and it wasn't the guy like at the end of the road doing the kind of bulldogs.
He was cool, man. Like, and when you hear like Alex talk about it, it's like he was obviously like appreciating of the arts and the culture that was going on. Like Mr. Sebastian like was so much more than just this weird old Leatherman. Like he was like vibrant artist, interested in what was going on. So Alex starts getting like iconic images tattooed by Mr. Sebastian and talking to him. And although he was not an official apprentice of Mr. Sebastian, he gives a lot of credit, and Mr. Sebastian acknowledges having taught Alex a lot about tattooing. And one of the things that was so amazing when I actually put on my interviewer hat, not just talking as friends, he started off, like his idea of a tattoo artist was, I'm going to be like Mr. Sebastian.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just starting tattooing, he was piercing. I'm like, really? You're a piercer? And he's like, yeah, I did it for a while, and then I realized like, I'm not the, you know, like I need to just concentrate on tattooing. I'm like, well, who'd you pierce? And he's like, he pierced Lee Bowery. Which, if you know anything about club culture and design and costume in the 90s, huge deal. Who's the dancer he also pierced? The punk modern dancer? I'm forgetting.
He tattooed Ron Athey.
Very famous.
Tattooed Ron Athey.
Tattooed Ron Athey. Yeah, but I'm talking about like the piercing. Oh, he's tattooed a bunch of famous people. But so anyways, like there's all this like I'll look his name up later, but punk, modern dance. He was innovative in the 80s and early 90s. So he pierced like all these people when he was first starting because he wanted to be like Mr. Sebastian. I just thought that was so cool.
Yeah.
Right.
Like so much, also worth noting, like so much of tattoo and piercing history is just like weird queer or queer adjacent intellectual misfits, right? Sebastian, Alex, Ed Hardy, Samuel Stewart, Armand Dietzel before them, like this Cliff Raven, this weird kind of intersection of like curious intellectual kind of, you know, people who are interested in history and figuring stuff out and learning and iterating, like that underpins, like that attitude that underpins basically like the whole kind of modern piercing and tattooing industry, I think.
So you remember the ones that I said like, well, like, I don't know if you needed to be completely naked to show your tattoos, but okay.
When I first saw this at Jeremy's house, I snapped it and sent it to Alex. He was like, where did you get that photo from?
Totally.
Yeah.
But like, and then you'll see like, you know, but then this one's artistically arranged where he's showing you the angel Michael. That's like, isn't that Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, it's so weird because like now we're getting into like the history that I know and I remember, which also becomes less interesting to me because it's not to be discovered because it was experienced. So the shot that started Into You in London was you really can't overstate it. It was a huge deal. Like, it signified like this was, before that term new school of tattooing, this was the new school. Like, it was hip, it was colorful, it was everything that a tattoo shop was not up until that point. Unfortunately, a lot of the history has been left out. What isn't talked about is the name, the original location, all of that was a woman named Tina Marie. And she was like the first, she'll talk in the interview as like believing that she was the first female piercer. There were some other female piercers before her, but again, like those histories were so, even at that time, you know, even like 5 years previous, were like so hard to find. Like, so she really genuinely thought she was the first female piercer.
Yeah.
So she's like, hey Alex, I want to do this. They had met, and you can find out how they met and stuff, reading the stuff, and also the book. So they meet, and she's like, I got this idea. When you get tired of the US, why don't you come back and join the shop? So he's like, that's a great idea, let's do the shop. She gets it started before Alex had come back. Alex is like, let's get Curly in there. And so they get Curly in there, and they really start this team. And at this time, like, you know, like, this is like National Enquirer, where they're like making this freak show. Elaine's, this is Elaine Angel's tongue, and they're showing Alex, and like, it's just really like shocking. It's also shocking and provocative at the time. But it really is like, it's changing culture. So you can see more photos and read more and like the articles. One of the things, again, like, nobody talks about Tina Marie anymore. Why? Because she's living off in the fucking Caribbean islands making pizza, living a wonderful life with her kids. She's just not in a piercing suit. But she would, like, if you know about Naomi Campbell having her navel pierced, this woman. If you want to know about, you know, like Chrissy Turlington having her navel pierced, this woman. Like, huge part of history that we don't want to forget and we really do want to acknowledge. More Genesis Peorage stuff and the crazy piercing being documented and performance art and all that stuff. That was Lee Bowery. This was original art that was done off of a photograph, a very iconic photograph where it's like at these safety pens with candied lips and it looks like it's staged. The cheek piercings were real. The cheek piercings were done by Alex Binney. But you can come dig deeper in there.
Finally, the answer.
I know, and this is what I promised everyone. It's like, yeah, the rise of the PK, the rise of the UK piercing history. Yeah, it's in this room. Because it's like really it's super finite. Like, we can really look to Pauline Clark, who had a husband that was really into tattooing, had a friend that was dying that had started a book on piercing. She liked to write, she liked journalism. She's like, I'll finish this project for, you know, in the name of my friend that was passing away. And as she's finishing the project, she's like, well, you gotta get pierced if you're gonna write about piercing. Next thing you know, she's hooked. And not only is she writing books, she's finishing up the one book for a friend, she then goes on to write 3 more books. And then she's like, she really loves the community of it. And she's seeing that there's all these people all over the place that are starting to have this interest, and she wants to build this community. So she starts off with the Piercing Association of the UK. These are just fans, these are just people coming together. One of the things that's so interesting about the history here for me is this was all before the APP. The UK, like, that's the takeaway from this. They were organizing before America was organizing. It just couldn't stay. It just kept falling apart. So they started off as just enthusiasts. Till, who we talked about over there, the incredible Till, he was one of the first members. Rudy Inhelder from the tattoo, he was the first member. So like you're seeing like all of these histories are intertwining, they're coming together. And then you're like, oh, well, now there's more than one person doing it. It's more than Mr. Sebastian. There's several people that are starting to pierce, including Patrick Bartholomew. Sacred Debris, I can't pump it enough. It's great for the history. Sean Porter over at Sacred Debris really loves Patrick Bartholomew and does a lot of digging into his history. But he's another important person that was around at this time that was really promoting.
South African ex-mercenary who moved to the UK.
Yeah, you can read, like, he would do articles, so it wasn't just the Mr. Sebastian show. Other people are starting to come up. When you get a chance, lovely letter, November 2nd, 1988. It was sent by Pauline to Gauntlet, and it's telling you exactly about their circulation, exactly what the scene was looking like, exactly what the membership was looking like, and how it was growing. You can see their beginning body piercing archive, their body piercing guidelines. You can see what the original members list. I would love people from UK to come over and read that, because I think it's going to fuck them up.
Yeah,
they're like,
wild.
I don't know any of these people. Like, and there's all this history, like all these people, all this history.
And I remember, so I was like 15, 16 in the mid-90s, and I remember like starting to go up to London, buying punk records, buying import tattoo magazines, buying Modern Primitives that had come out in 1989. And these books, the Body Art magazine, journal, Pauline's books were on the shelves in like the kind of punk record shops and alternative bookshops in London, and they were really pivotal for a whole generation of us. And in these magazines, there are interviews with Mr. Sebastian, there are interviews with Alex. Actually, Alex I think he edits or he writes one of these issues.
He writes.
Quite.
He's like, his writings are in a lot. He might even be in issue 1.
Yeah, like Lal Hardy's in here. Like, this is for me again. This is probably my route into doing what I do as a historian, because like Ed Hardy before them, like there's this interest in where all this stuff comes from, and documenting it.
So it starts with like people that are enthusiasts, professional piercers in the UK, and oh my God, all these like people on the continent want to get involved. So then they do the European Professional Piercing Association. Then they just kind of fall apart, and I don't know if it really matters like why it fell apart, but they kind of fell apart. And then this guy, and this gets complicated because he used to be my business partner. Grant Dempsey, I met him at, the Gauntlet was doing workshops in Europe. We were trying to expand. And we were doing workshops in Europe through this really dodgy company called IMAX. And I believe they're still around. I think, or is it Max? No, it's IMAX. Yeah, their supplier of tattoo and cheap body jewelry.
Oh yeah. There was a lot of them around.
Yeah, like they just, anyway, so we were in bed with these not very ethical folks, and he's like, well, I want to take an advanced class. And they're like, oh, we have an advanced class coming up. And he goes, and it's like, he gets there and I'm like, no, this is a basic beginner's class. And he's like, they took my money and told me this is an advanced class. So I got him a refund, and he's like, all right, King, if you ever need anything, and like, whatever. This isn't my history, but like, we ended up becoming business partners. But he became obsessed with like American hygiene, American technology, internally threaded, like all of this stuff. And
we couldn't get shit over here, man.
No.
Like, so I was like importing jewelry from the US, like just for personally. Like you couldn't get anything. We'd see pictures online and in magazines, and it was like you just couldn't get anything.
So I think from like, I'm guessing from like 1997, he started coming to APP. Then we went into the business together. Again, this isn't my history, but I was around when it was first forming in like 94, and then I got out of it because of the politics early on. And he's like, King, you gotta go to the APP, we gotta go. You're going, that's all there is to it. And that was in 1999, and like a sucker, I've been coming back ever since. But one of the things he did was he got involved with taking the APP to Europe. And a lot of people don't know this, but in 1997 was actually the first time the APP had a conference in Europe. And it was in London, and it was a one-day seminar. They had like 200 people there. It was like huge. Like, you wouldn't even think in 1997 there were that many piercers in the UK. Just as big as today's conferences in the UK, but it was 1997. Went really good. Good enough to where Beth Rusumsky, who's roaming around, she's also living history, she's like, let's do it. Let's do a European conference. So we did one, and it was kind of like the reverse of the 78 conference. Ours was a great conference. It just wasn't fun. So when we went back the next year, we did a class on, and this is how you start an organization. And off the back of that, we've been helping sister organizations all over the world ever since, realizing our place is not to tell the world how to do it, but how we can help folks support in their own ideas of what health and safety and hygiene and membership or not membership should look like. So that came out of those. Got to touch on Wildcat. Huge. Like, yeah, like their jewelry, whatever, by today's standards. But at that time, they were making some sick-ass dope designs that everybody loved. And you know, they shaped what the industry looked like because they decided to go in this cutthroat manner and how do we secure the market by making this stuff as cheap and as ubiquitous as we can and kill the competition that way. And unfortunately, what he then did is set up a race to the bottom. So it took a long time, like it was a very successful business model, like everyone still knows who Wildcat is, and it's changed hands and it's no longer owned by him. But they also did some great, crazy things and performance art and all that stuff, but I'm gonna let you read up on that. I just wanted to show some representation here. Elaine Davidson, who was, I don't know that she still is the most purest woman in the world. I'm sorry that I'm getting tired because like it does need to be talked about the fact that there are maybe 3 black people that you're going to see in this entire exhibit just because the photos aren't there. And that's something that needs to be talked about. Yeah. These were different times. Things were much more socially segregated, even if not just culturally segregated. There just weren't as many folks that were crossing over
the tattoo, especially in the UK, the history of tattooed people of colour is very badly and undertold, something which some of us are trying to do better on because their stories are out there. You know, they're not as visible as well known, but there are of course people, but the piercing history is even less told.
So when it's there, you know, we need to celebrate it, we need to feature it, it is there. It's just unfortunate a lot of it wasn't recorded and there's just not a lot to find. So it's not like, oh, once again, you're not representing. It's like, anytime I found something to represent it, I did. There's just not a lot there yet. Hopefully we'll find some more, but there's just not a lot of representation there. This is wonderful. I asked Nikki Holmes to write up like, so how the UK APP formed. Why don't you tell us that story so we can get it for the record? And wonderful description of the early formation. Please take your time to read that. And if you were around in the beginning, then you know the Grangers are coming in 2024. I'm super excited about that. I think we've helped folks.
Yeah, I mean, we can answer questions, but like, you must be tired. Our tour's turned into, what time is it now?
Don't look.
7:30. There we go. Thank you for sitting with us. Yeah.
What I will say is those that joined us late, we will continue on. Give us like a 5-minute potty break and drink of water break. We will continue on because some of the early history is really great. If you're up to it, I'll hold you up. All right, great.
Or we're here like, I'm doing tours throughout the week.
Exactly. So yeah, if you also want to, by the way, thank you everyone that is here that has rolled with like, this is not the conference that you're used to. We really appreciate you showing up anyways with the constant like changing landscape of what it looks like. Because things have relaxed, yes, I'm not talking about for all the classes, most of the classes if you want to go to, even though you can't change your schedule, they are still taking waiting lists. And in the case of the tours, if the tour is sold out or booked up or you don't worry about it, just see when the tour is and just come in. It's fine, okay? Drop down. So if you're like, okay, I gotta get out of here, you can. And you can come back and catch up the beginning later, or if you stick around, we'll do the beginning. Are there any questions?
We've factored everyone into submission. Fact cannon.
We do that. Don't worry, we do that.
And that's also just a small smattering of the facts we have available to you.
We were actually rushing through,
Yeah.
which is like crazy.